Very, very good. Well, thank you very much for staying. This is going to be one of the most exciting panels that you're going to hear during the day. It's focused on lowering government risk and dealing with the invisible threat. And we've assembled a fantastic panel of experts that are going to share with you, I think, some very insightful things about how their agencies and organizations are handling this. We'll be focusing on three themes: standards and guidance, practical application of that guidance, and then advanced research when it comes to dealing with advanced threats. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief introduction, we'll start with Dr. Rouse from NIST.
Thanks, Melvin. It's great to be here today. Standards and guidelines, as you know from NIST, play a big role in cybersecurity in the past, present, and going into the future. I think our biggest challenge today, we are literally living through the greatest time in our history as far as the technology, the advancements, and everything that this innovation is bringing to us. It's making us more productive. It's allowing us to do things we never thought we could do before. And that's the good news. But there is a soft underbelly to all this technology. The bad news is that we have to be able to protect what we deploy. And I think there has to be a conversation at some point, probably fairly soon, that recognizes our cybersecurity problems, because we still, with all of the money we spend on cyber, we still have significant numbers of breaches and damaging attacks going on public sector and private sector. I think we have to start looking at the world from two different perspectives. We have to be able to work in the world that I call above the waterline, which is what all of us deal with every day, the consumer view of cybersecurity, managing your assets and things within your organizations. But there's a whole other conversation going on below the waterline. This is where complexity lives. This is 60 million lines of operating system and middleware and applications and firmware and integrated circuits. It's called the stack that gives you the great capability that you have in everything from your smartphone to your tablet to a power plant to a medical device. And unless and until we understand the problems below the waterline, how to build more trustworthy, secure systems, components, and services, we will continue to be having these devastating attacks as long and as far as the eye can see. So that's our biggest challenge at NIST, is to work on the engineering aspects below the waterline, working with industry and government to try to achieve solutions.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Ron. So Joe Mitchell, who is the Section Chief for Enterprise Data Analytics at the FBI, can you give us a brief introduction on the kind of things you're working on?
Sure. Again, I'm Joe Mitchell. So I currently manage a large portfolio of analytical systems, as well as some enrichment tools as it relates to like geospatial or human language translation type tools. A lot of visualization tools. We also manage the e-discovery type requirements that we have for litigation holds on data. And we're in the process of some major transformation in our organization that will lead to some cyber resiliency, where we're in the process of collapsing a lot of disparate systems to sort of create big data environments for our organization to kind of work with. And so we definitely have our plate full.
Fantastic. And I think I told you backstage, we want to thank you for your service in law enforcement, helping to keep us safe. So we've talked about standards and this idea of practical application. Dr. Bill Vanderlyn, can you share with us a little bit about what you're doing in IARPA and research?
Yeah, so IARPA is the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity. And as you can tell from our name, we're a lot like DARPA. In fact, we're modeled after DARPA, so we fund high-risk, high-payoff research. The differences are DARPA is focused on the defense community, whereas we're focused on the intelligence community. And also, we're much smaller than DARPA, so we need to very carefully apply our research dollars into carefully selected areas. But we do a wide variety of topics, everything from the cybersecurity that we'll talk about today, but also hardware supply chain assurance, high-performance computing, geolocation of radio frequency signals, and then more things in very different areas like language analysis, video and image analysis, and even prediction of geopolitical events. So we do a lot of different things.
Fantastic. So we have a great panel. Let's get right to the questions. So I'll start with you, Ron. We have a series and a level of complexity in systems today that's unprecedented. And with the advances of technology going forward, do you think we should be optimistic or pessimistic with respect to our ability to protect the assets that we have?
That's a great question. I'm by nature optimistic, but I would say I'm optimistic with an asterisk. And the asterisk is, it depends on our ability to understand how to manage complexity. I don't think complexity is ever going to go away because, the technology is what it is. But we do have the ability through good architectural and design constructs to be able to design systems that reduce that we call it attack surface. And when you look at the way we deploy our systems today, we have the general purpose computing mentality. You build an operating system and it's really, really good if it supports lots and lots of applications. You support as many users and as many different customers as you can. But that is something that breeds complexity. So in an ideal world where you're talking about developing systems that are a lot more trustworthy, secure, and as you said, resilient, you have to go back to that kind of leaner and meaner architectural construct. There's the term we use in computing called thin client. It really means we pare down the system to only do things that are absolutely necessary. I use a kind of a metaphor. I call it the trusted garage door opener. It only does one thing. It opens up my garage door and closes it. It does one thing, but it does it with high assurance. It always works. And we know how to design systems that are a lot reduced functionality, highly trustworthy, not everywhere, but we need to be able to decide where that kind of capability needs to be deployed and then have the ability to architect and engineer solutions in those places. So that's why I say I'm optimistic with an asterisk. We know how to do it. Whether we'll have the will to do it, that's a whole other matter. And that's something that I don't think any of us have the answer. This show was not over yet, so we don't really know.
Yeah, well, let's explore that a little bit. Let's pull the thread on that. So, Joe, you're in an investigative and intelligence organization and agency, and I know that cyber resiliency is an important aspect of what the FBI does. I'm really interested if you can share with us, to whatever extent you can, what is the FBI actually doing to combat cyber threats, and how are they approaching it?
Sure. So the nice thing is we have the luxury of that we investigate cyber crimes, and so we're always aware of what threats are happening, and we have the ability to look at that from a defensive posture as well. Predominantly, the Bureau's been kind of a closed-off kind of network for the longest time. I don't want to say it doesn't have its siloed of excellence in different areas of the organization. However, they are closed off. Probably our most open systems that we have are more on the federal, state, local, and tribal type data that's on the unclassed side. But most of our other stuff is pretty protected. And so as we start to look at sort of transforming our sort of footprint, if you will, with all of our systems that interact and perform, different missions in different operational branches, whether it's investigative or intelligence, counterterrorism, whatever. As we bring those systems together in a sort of big data environment, it's affording us to sort of remove the chances of risk by bringing more focus on a larger platform and bringing pockets of excellence that exist within the organization that are responsible for running those systems. We're also doing major efforts to transform, the amount of cross-domain solutions we have, the amount of circuits we have, all of those kinds of things. And we're doing it in a way now where it's not often seen, but we've actually convince the IT infrastructure side to move in a more agile way, like software development works. And what that's afforded us is it's also afforded us to bring security in, policy people in, to where we have to look at sort of modernizing policy so that it works around infrastructure and software, and security is engaged in that conversation so that we're ensuring that we're sort of plugging the holes as we go, as we build these systems. But I believe the convergence of all those systems is making us more resilient. And of course, like probably many agencies, we certainly do a lot of penetration testing, things of that sort, like every organization and company should. And so those are things that we'll continue to do. And I think it's the retrospectives, it's the offensive and defensive aspects of our organization always talking. And that's how we stay optimistic.
Well, it's really refreshing to hear the person responsible for data science and analytics to be so integrally ingrained and integrated into the cyber intelligence and cyber aspects. I think this is the kind of collaboration and integration that all agencies aspire to, and it's great to hear that the FBI is doing it. So now in research, Bill, we have this desire to fortify systems and mitigate risk, lowering risk in overall government. What kind of research activities are you engaged in that help to do that?
Okay, so we have several programs going on right now which I think are of interest. The first is called SCITE, S-C-I-T-E, which is Scientific Advances in Insider Threat Evaluations. So this program is led by Dr. Paul Lehner, who's a mathematical psychologist. He's doing some fairly fundamental work in the area of what kind of behavior is associated with honesty or deception. Another program of interest is called CAUSE, C-A-U-S-E, which is Cyber Attack Automated Unconventional Sensor Environment. So in the case of CAUSE, looking at various indicators of where a cyber attack might be imminent. So let me give you an example. On the dark web, there are various hacker tools available, things like 0 days and botnets. So as with most things, the price of those is dependent on supply and demand. If one sees a spike in the price of those tools, that may indicate someone's arming up for imminent cyber attack. The third program we're doing is called Virtue, which simply stands for Virtuous User Environment. And this is using sort of a cloud-based and virtual machine-based enhancements to the user environment to protect against both insider and outsider threats.
That's fantastic. I'm really happy about that because I love research, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot of research projects that are really focusing on some of the threats that we are facing. Let me make it a little bit more personal and talk about a use case. Intel is focused on a number of use cases with respect to artificial intelligence and data science, and one of them is autonomous vehicles. And so, Ron, I'm going to ask this question of you. What responsibility does the IT industry have with respect to use cases like autonomous vehicles, where vehicle and passenger safety is paramount, to ensure that the systems that they produce have the proper security construct, the right ways to protect their system from cyber threats? What responsibility do they have to make sure they're sufficiently trustworthy?
Well, I'll tell you, that's to me the most important question of the day. Because we talk about a national dialogue. We have some significant cybersecurity challenges in front of us now. We see them every day. The question is, we have, it's kind of like a continuum. We have regulation on one end and open market, free market on the other end. And then there's everything in between. And if you want to look at a good example of how we handle that in another space, look at the evolution of automobiles and automobile safety. My first car, a long time ago, barely had a seatbelt. And then there was a period where airbags were optional equipment. You could decide whether you want the airbag or the 8-track. I know some of you out there don't remember what 8-tracks are, but that's how we used to listen to music in the day. And then, of course, there's steel reinforced doors. And so you've seen, this evolution. Some of it was regulation. Some of it is just open free market with automobile makers wanting to give you the safest vehicle they can produce, because that's good for customers. It's like building airplanes. You want to have airplanes that don't follow the sky. So the question is, where do we fall on this balance point between regulation and free market? We kind of are in no man's land right now. We don't have any carrots and there's no sticks. There's no incentive for some of the companies to build those things into the cars. Like in my automobile, they don't ask me to install my own airbag. It comes with the car. I don't install my own seatbelt. It comes with the car. So I think there's going to have to be a dialogue that involves government, industry, together working to figure out where that balance point is. Because if we don't do that, we're going to see things like that happened last fall, where you have a distributed denial of service attack that was launched with hundreds and thousands of attacks on consumer devices in your homes, baby monitors, routers, cameras, things that you buy as consumer products. The default password's not changed. Somebody comes in, the attackers know the architecture, they know what's on that device. They co-opt it, and they get hundreds and thousands of those, and they turn those around as weapons against innocent people and organizations. We saw that last fall. Krebs' website, 2/3 of the internet. Okay, at some point, innovation's great, but if those are starting to be turned around, that gets back to your autonomous vehicle. If I'm in my car and I have an artificial intelligence program that was developed by some young upstarts in the Silicon Valley, I want to make sure they used secure coding techniques on that program. Now, that's a question of standards, some regulation, how much, how far. I don't have the answer to that. At NIST, we're not policymakers, we're scientists and engineers. But that discussion is going to have to take place because this technology is not stopping, and you're not stopping buying it. And we're going to start to see the effects of not paying attention. I think it's an important question.
Now, I can assure you, Ron, that the ones we're working on at Intel have security built inside.
I would expect nothing less.
All right, so Joe, let's talk about some choices, because the mission of the FBI is expanding and growing. And at the same time while this mission is growing, you have to spend money on protecting assets and creating cyber frameworks that work. But you also have to spend money on growing your capabilities to support the mission and on innovation. How do you make these tough choices and where to spend your money and resources?
So this is sort of a topic that kind of came up at lunch for me with some other folks. And the big challenge in my organization is the way in which we stood, like most of our disparate systems, up. They were very myopic in nature. They were about a specific problem at that given time. And so technology to me, and this is maybe why I'm somewhat of an evangelist right now in my organization, is that technology has caught up so well for us that we're able to sort of attack problems that we couldn't otherwise do based on policy and things of that sort. So we deal with the realm of classifications and caveats and things of that sort. And so, you know, when we think of our organization, and obviously we want to share our data with our partners, and how do we move data between IT framework to each organization, and then, you know, where are we putting our money, you know, in those areas. And so we've been able to kind of corral the problem by bringing, you know, like enterprise data management office in more tactically. We bring security in more tactically, like I had mentioned prior. We bring the attorneys. In fact, there's, as I mentioned at lunch, there's 2 that babysit me every day that make sure that we're doing the right things. But it's a balance of, you know, I guess it's sort of hard to put a price on stopping a threat. So at times, at the pace of mission, we have to spend money in order to handle a threat. But in other times, we're sort of trying to step back as much as we can to kind of look at the organization holistically and say, what will be the framework for the future of how we'll work with, again, the sort of unclassified environments that exist in law enforcement and intelligence, but then also how do we traverse our red fabrics and our yellow fabrics with a level of certainty that everything's secure. And so that brings things in like, you know, attribute-based access controls. It brings in enterprise, you know, tagging for certain data types. But it also means those trusted guards and cross-domain solutions need to be very secure. We need to ensure that standards are the same across the organizations to where I have a level of faith that the attributes mean the same thing to the next organization, or that the trusted guard is only passing certain information, whether one directional or bidirectional, things like that. But we are constantly kind of vetting our sort of growth of these systems by what we call a zero-based budget process. So the good news is that we're able to, depending on where you are in the organization, you get visibility across the entire enterprise of how funds are being spent, whether it is on innovation or is it on a very myopic type problem that they're trying to solve. And so from there, that's what's sort of creating the conversations, it's creating the collaboration that you want to see, to where we're able to find out whether those are duplicative needs across the organization. Is it already solved elsewhere, but one door down, we're just not communicating. So it's kind of I think of it more like a sort of an orchestra concert, if you will, to make all those pieces fall in line. But like I stated in the first question, I mean, we're in a major transformational state where we're getting control of a lot of the sort of siloed systems, and really taking a hard look at bringing it all together, and just, you know, increasing our ability to provide services to the field, making agents, analysts, everybody power users of these systems, because we are just doing it better and more securely and at scale, and the performance, you know, things like that. So.
Yeah, that's right. Innovation is hard, and it does require the rigor that you described, being able to take a look at the enterprise class activities and make some reasonable, sound decisions about them. That's hard work, so that's good to hear. So, Bill, you know, we know what we know. We know that some things we don't know, but what are the things that we do to try to identify how to deal with the things we don't know when it comes to lowering risk and cyber threat?
So I think you're quoting Donald Rumsfeld there, and as he pointed out, it's the unknown unknowns that really keep you up at night.
That's right.
And I wish I had the answer to that, but it seems like every time we think we're secure, there's going to be another hack, another data breach, another insider threat, which ends up spilling more data. So all we can do is the best job that we know how to. I don't think there's anything beyond that.
Yep, sure. I mean, I think with folks in research and standards and guidance and people who are practically applying these kinds of things, we certainly we're starting to make significant progress. And I think most of us are very pleased that we have leaders in government that are actually focused on these issues. So I really want to give you a chance to share with us what you think the one or two things that we ought to take away from any discussion around lowering risk and identifying invisible threats. So I'm going to open it up to each of you. Ron, if you wouldn't mind starting. Sure. What are the one or two salient points that we need to walk out of this discussion with?
You know, I think given our current climate, and we're going to be waiting now for industry to evolve to more trustworthy components and products, but there's some things we can do right now on our own. And it gets back to the topic you were addressing, managing complexity. How do I do that? Well, you look at everything you own across the entire enterprise, and you know, we use the triage concept at NIST. It's one of our first standards called FIPS 199. Everything in the federal government is categorized in the low, moderate, or high bucket based on mission impact if that asset is compromised or lost. And that's the first thing you have to do is I kind of make the analogy, it's like a safe deposit box. You know, you have a lot of important stuff in your house. You have a lock on your front door, but if you're like me, you take some of your stuff to the bank and get a safe deposit box. Why? Because that's a safer domain. It's got the outer structure of the bank. It's got the vault, the two keys like the Air Force captains in Cheyenne Mountain. You know, we trust our Air Force captains, but not together sometimes. You want to make sure that they're, you know, dual authorization. And so you have all those things that are, because the asset that you're dealing with is more important. So in your organizations, you have to go and make those hard decisions. What stuff is really important? Separate it into its own domain if possible, and then reduce the size and complexity of that domain. You really have to go lean and mean for the things that you care about. Because as Melvin was talking about, the vulnerabilities that you deal with every day are the known vulnerabilities. There's a whole level of those vulnerabilities at the next level called the unknowns, the 0 days. And then there's another level below that that comes from the advanced persistent threat, where the adversary actually comes through your network, establishes a presence, unpack their suitcase, take up residency, and then they will create new vulnerabilities in your systems and networks that they can leave dormant until they want to come back and pull the trigger. Now, 2/3 of those vulnerabilities are totally off your radar, even evading the best scanning tools. The only way you get around that is to make your organization's infrastructure smaller and more manageable, less complex, and then applying greater security measures like the safe deposit box to that particular domain. So that's something you can do now without having any improvements from industry or any more policies out of government. You have to take this bull by the horns yourself, because nobody else is coming to the rescue anytime soon.
Joe?
Yeah, so I've thought about this. I think there's a few things I would say. One is I totally agree with the sort of lean and mean approach, because that's kind of the world that I'm after right now, is to shrink the organization's footprint. I also think the collaboration communication is just tremendously huge. I know in just building our environment and having all of the stakeholders, the right stakeholders in the room, looking at what we're building and getting buy-in and getting an understanding of what we're trying to do is very key. I also think that something that we don't think about is like in the realm of like cross-domain solutions and where we're traversing fabrics. The idea of we always think like shrink them, have less of them, those kinds of things. But the fact is, in many cases, it's, you need to beef up your monitoring. You need to have a response plan. You need to have those kinds of things in place, because sometimes things aren't meant to converge. Some things aren't meant to be separate. I mean, it just depends. But I think looking at those kinds of things, like how are you prepared? What's your posture for dealing with the problem when it happens? And how fast can you bounce back from that threat? And I think that's what our organization does really well. We can always be better. But I can't emphasize having those kinds of things in place are very, very key.
Sure. Bill?
Well, speaking as an intelligence community professional, I would say never trust anyone.
Okay, I can believe in that. Well, that's very, very good. So Dr. Ron Rouse, Fellow at NIST, Joe Mitchell, Section Chief responsible for Enterprise Data Analytics at the FBI, and Dr. Bill Vanderlyn over at IARPA as Chief Scientist for National Intelligence. We really appreciate your insight in this area of lowering risk, because as we talk about this harnessing of the power of big data, artificial intelligence, and data science, we certainly appreciate your insights and how important it is to ensure we don't forget the important aspects associated with cyber and lowering the overall risk as we adopt the technology. So I want you guys to join me in thanking this panel.